Those of you who have been following my channel already for a while probably know that I'm relatively generous at providing sample photos, and often I also include settings into my sample photos. And some of you might already have noticed that there is something really odd going on in some of my camera settings, most specifically when you look at ISO. Because if we, for instance, have a look at this photo right here, you can see that I have used ISO 500. Even though it's super bright outside, you have the sun right in your frame, we're shooting at f1.2, we're shooting at shutter speeds of 1/22,000th of a second. So why didn't I drop the ISO to ISO 100 or the base ISO of my camera? And that's exactly what we're going to talk about in today's video. Why do I shoot at ISO 500 like literally 95% of the time without perceivable reason? But actually there is 3 reasons. And in today's video we're going to talk about these 3 reasons, and I'm going to rank them from least important to most important. So you better stay tuned till the end. And without further ado, let's jump right into it. And the first reason why I shoot ISO 500 most of the time is related to shutter speed. And if we go back to the previous image, here I've shot at a shutter speed of like 1/22,000th of a second. And in this case, for instance, I could have dropped the ISO of my camera and I would still have shutter speed snappy enough to absolutely freeze the action. But if we, for instance, consider this scene right here, where we shoot in mixed lighting under bridge, then you can see that if we shoot at the base ISO of the camera, now my shutter speed is actually 1/50th of a second. And as my subject passes through, you can see that the subject is blurry because of motion blur. And this actually brings me to the first reason why I shoot at ISO 500, because it gives me some more flexibility and some room regarding shutter speed to adjust to scenarios that I maybe did not really expect. So for this image here, if I had brought up the ISO to ISO 500, it would have given me significantly snappier shutter speeds by 2 stops, and to get my action to be frozen in time. And to back this up, in general, I recommend you really not sacrifice your shutter speed just to keep your ISO to the base ISO of your camera, because a noisier photo, by increasing the ISO, is always better than a photo that is blurry because the shutter speed was not fast enough. The next reason why I shoot at ISO 500 most of the time is related to the ISO gain structure of modern cameras. Because generally speaking, when we increase the ISO, we increase the brightness of our scene, but we also increase the noise in our scene. So in other words, as we increase the ISO from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800, you will see that the noise level will linearly go up. But in reality, that is not necessarily the case. So for instance, here we have the noise levels of the Fujifilm X-T5, and as we increase the ISO, you can see how the noise will get worse. And this happens until we reach a specific point at ISO 500 where something weird happens, because suddenly the noise levels get better, they drop. So there is less noise at ISO 500 than, let's say, at ISO 400 or ISO 320. But why is that? And what's happening here is that modern camera sensors are actually dual gain sensors, meaning that they do not just have one base ISO, ISO 100 generally, where the camera has the best technical image quality, the least amount of noise, the best dynamic range, and just the most flexible file to work with. But the camera also has a second base ISO, which for my camera, for instance, is ISO 500, where the noise performance is suddenly better again, and generally speaking, your dynamic range is also better again. So what does that mean in practice? Well, that means that in my case, for instance, I can shoot on the base ISO, or I can go on the second base ISO where I get much snappier shutter speeds, but the noise levels are, relatively speaking, still very, very minimal. Additionally, one can even go as far as to argue that if you have to choose between shooting at ISO 250 or ISO 500, you might even want to consider shooting at ISO 500, simply because it literally gives you the same image quality, the same dynamic range, the same noise performance, but now your shutter speed, since you boost the ISO 1 stop more, that also means that your shutter speeds are now 1 stop faster than they were before. So in other words, you might as well move from 250 ISO to 500, because it's going to give you 1 stop snappier shutter speeds, while the image quality will literally stay identical. And by the way, while the second base ISO of my X-T5 is ISO 500, this does not necessarily have to apply to your camera as well. Because on my Fuji X-T30, for instance, my second base ISO is 640, while on your Sony or on your Canon, it might be ISO 800 or even ISO 1600. It really depends on the brand and on the sensor that's being used in your camera. And I highly recommend you check out the website of Photons To Photos, which I'll link down below, because it's actually giving you a very comprehensive overview of what the second base ISO for basically any camera model is. And the next reason why I shoot at ISO 500 95% of the time is related to dynamic range, and more specifically to high dynamic range scenes. So if we go back to the example from the introduction, here we have a high dynamic range scene because we have really dark shadows and we have really bright highlights. And the problem of cameras is that the dynamic range of your sensor is limited, meaning that you cannot properly expose the full latitude of the image from the very dark tones to the very bright tones, because the very dark tones are so dark and the very bright tones are so bright that they actually do not fit into the natural dynamic range of your sensor. And on Fujifilm cameras, there is actually a little trick that you can apply to boost the dynamic range of your sensor, which is called dynamic range settings. And what dynamic range settings effectively do is that they boost the shadows, so the darkest parts of your scene, while at the same time they bring down the highlights of your scene. And they do so by boosting the shadows by either 1 or 2 stops. And that requires a higher ISO by default. And you might have guessed it, but the ISO that's required for dynamic range settings on my X-T5 is ISO 500. And using dynamic range settings has actually a few advantages, because first of all, if you shoot in JPEGs and you underexpose your file, you can simply not just go in and recover those shadows in post, because that information is missing because the file is a JPEG and only has very limited information available. But by using dynamic range settings, you boost these shadows by 1 or 2 stops, meaning that now there is more detail visible in these shadows, even in your JPEGs. But even in RAW, it's absolutely useful because first of all, I've noticed that it becomes really hard to overexpose your highlights because they are still exposed at the base ISO of your camera where the dynamic range is best, while at the same time your shadows will be boosted by 2 stops, meaning that if you had not taken dynamic range settings, you would have underexposed your file and later brought up these shadows in post. Well, this you do not really have to do anymore if you use dynamic range settings, because the camera already brings up these shadows by default, meaning that you will already have a properly exposed file in camera, which will give you a better base if you start editing the file in Lightroom. And so far it might have sounded like ISO 500 is the greatest thing ever, but there is in fact really good reasons to still use the base ISO of your camera, even though I rarely do. And the first scenario in which shooting at the base ISO makes sense is when you have a dual scene. Let's say, for instance, you have a grey overcast sky. There is generally no bright highlights that would have to be protected. In other words, it doesn't really make sense to shoot in dynamic range settings because you do not have a high dynamic range. So in these cases, you generally just expose your photo to the right and use your base ISO, because the base ISO will still provide you the cleanest results, as we've seen in the graph by Photons To Photos. Then the second scenario in which shooting at the base ISO makes sense is when you shoot static scenes, because I've told you before that there is instances where you never know whether something interesting is going to happen and you definitely want to freeze it having a shutter speed that's fast enough. But if you predictably know that you're going to shoot a static scene like architecture, for instance, then it does not really make sense to boost your ISO, because you're basically just introducing unnecessary noise into your scene. And what you should do instead is to just expose your scene at the base ISO and just use a shutter speed that's slow, because nothing is going to move in your scene and therefore no motion blur will keep into your scene. Additionally, the opposite of a short exposure is arguably a long exposure, and sometimes shooting long exposures is absolutely amazing, but in that case it's actually counterintuitive to raise the ISO because it's going to give you faster shutter speeds, but you want slower shutter speeds, so decrease your ISO in these cases to the base ISO, which will not only give you the cleanest results, but also shutter speeds that are long enough to actually create that long exposure effect. And then the final scenario that accounts for these 5%, at least right now, where I do not shoot at ISO 500, which is when I shoot at night. The days here are relatively long at this point, so night photography is not something I do a lot right now. But if you do, ISO 500 is generally speaking not enough to properly expose your scene. And you will generally need an ISO between 1000 and 12,800 depending on how dark it is. In that case, you will have to raise the ISO beyond ISO 500 to properly expose the scene. And if you're interested in another video where we turn conventional knowledge of cameras and gear upside down, then I invite you to check out this video up here in which I tell you about the myth of technical image quality. And with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hopefully see you in next week's video. Bye.